But Greece is more than just a place of research. Quote, other countries, wrote Lawrence Durrell, offer you discoveries in manners, lore, or landscape. Greece offers you something harder, the discovery of yourself, end of quote. Christopher Bakken continues those thoughts by Durrell through his 2013 memoir and writes, quote, in Greece, I risk becoming pure verb, end of quote. Christopher Bakken is a well-known American poet. His collections After Greece from 2001, Goat Funeral from 2006, and his translation from modern Greek into English of the Lionsgate Poems of Titos Patrikios from 2006 have won numerous awards, including the Helen C. Smith Memorial Award for Best Book of Poetry, the Texas Institute of Letters Best Translation Award, and the T.S. Eliot Poetry Prize. In its last annual meeting in Bloomington, Indiana, the Modern Greek Studies Association of North America recognized his work as the best new writing on Greece. And it's at that context that I first saw Bakken, saw his presentation, and immediately thought, common hour, common hour, common hour. A few things about Bakken. Christopher Bakken holds a PhD in literature and creative writing from the University of Houston, an MFA in poetry from Columbia University, has held a Fulbright in Bucharest, and is currently associate professor of English and the chair of the department at Allegheny College on the other side of Pennsylvania. He's also the director of one of the most exciting writing workshops in Greece, and you see it here, which runs this summer from June 9th to July 7th. Students that are interested, there is material in the back, but you can also contact me. And this is a workshop that we hope that FNM will have a bigger presence in. But Bakken's credentials are more than scholarly and literary. His explorations in language, history, and politics take a direct corporeal form as he becomes a verb, or almost becomes a verb, through food. He has cooked for Michael Pollan. He has cooked for CBS Saturday Morning Early Show. In 2005, he won the Best Burger Contest by Food and Wine magazine. And he organizes an organic produce cooperative out of his garage in Pennsylvania. Christopher does not simply teach at a liberal arts college, but embodies the practices of a liberal arts education. He turns the world into a verb, both literally and figuratively through his actions. Now at 5 p.m., Christopher will cook with the Environmental Action Alliance at the Writer's House, and thank you for serving pizza, and I invite you all to come. And at 7 o'clock, he will also do a reading of his poetry, not his Greek memoir, where we will all feast from the hors d'oeuvres that we've all collectively produced, also at the Writer's House. Bakken's book, I should note, is used this semester as a textbook for 3 different classes. It's a wonderful book, and I urge you to buy a copy if you don't have, and we'll be selling some in the back. You can get it signed by the author. But before handing over the podium to Christopher Bakken, I want to thank the art department, but also the Writer's House and the Program of International Studies for making Christopher's visit possible. So without further ado, let's invite the verb to come up.
Kalimera. Thank you. Thanks so much to Kostis for bringing me to Franklin and Marshall, my food pornography show here and culinary propaganda gig. I'm also really appreciate the Common Hour Committee selecting me, and to all the departments that made it possible for me to be here. I'm going to do what I'm going to call a memoir sandwich. In this sandwich, memoir is the bread. I'm going to read a little bit at the beginning from Honey Olive's Octopus, just to kind of set the scene. And then I'll do the talk part, and there's a slight exercise that begins with. And then I'll return to the memoir at the end. I leave a little mystery hanging at the beginning. I want you to remember. Are you ready? Do you have enough pizza? Yeah. Eat some fruit too, please. This is how the book opens. Let me see if I can make this go full screen. How's that? Tasos of Thasos, whose olives we shall pick, has been drinking Siporo at a wedding all night, until just hours ago, in other words, so when he greets us at the port, we can see he's a cheerful disaster. The list of things Tasos Kouzis can do is daunting. With equal proficiency, he manages to be a restaurateur, farmer, shepherd, octopus fisherman, rabbit hunter, traditional dancer, and wedding singer. The fact that he served in the Greek Special Forces means he has other skills he cannot disclose. He's also indisputably handsome. Black hair, close-cropped beard, irrepressible smile, which helps him play his various roles with perfect sprezzatura. It hurts me to drive slowly, he tells us, so put on your seatbelts. In spite of his hangover, he attacks each switchback. We zoom past the massive marble quarries, so huge that cranes and bulldozers at the bottom look like toys, through the village of Panagia, where the competing identical cafes in the main square are opening simultaneously, past 3 deserted beach towns and around 2 herds of errant sheep and 1 lost cow. Abruptly, as we round the southern shoulder of the island, the dense shag of pine and oak gives way to a barren forest of boulders that drops jaggedly down to the sea. Tasos pulls up next to the guardrail on the wrong side of the road so we can orient ourselves. The wind is blowing from the southeast, making visible what is usually obscured. Samothraki, the most haunted and pagan of all Greek islands, which agitates the horizon like a purple gash. Beyond that, we see the faintly pulsating outline of Asia Minor and the low molars of Limnos. And after 2 more bends in the road, we spy Mount Athos, sacred home of 1,000 monks and hermits, and not a single woman. Legend has it, no woman has set foot in the peninsula since the Virgin Mary herself. In order to fetch us at the port, Tasos left his parents behind in the olive grove. There we are. So we drop our bags at the pension where we'll be staying and join them right away. Don't worry, we came here to work, I remind Tasos. His parents, undistracted by the noisy fowl that surround them, peacocks, geese, ducks, and dozens of chickens, are just pouring the first coffee of the day and unloading a crate full of breakfast. Tasos' father, Stamatis, rises to greet me with a leathery handshake and 2 kisses. Though now, sporting a harvest costume of flannel and denim, he's a fisherman and looks it. Aquiline nose, sunburned skin, a shock of unruly hair. Tasos' mother, Eva, has something of the Venus of Willendorf about her. Yeah, I always wait to see if anyone... Venus of Willendorf? Right on. There's the liberal arts in action right there. She has something of the Venus of Willendorf about her. She's utterly sturdy, working here all month beside the men, yet she radiates maternal softness and grace. Both parents seem a little stunned that I've actually come. Surely my vow to join their olive harvest, sworn after a long night of drinking the previous summer, was not in earnest. Yet here I am, with my brother in tow, stocking-capped, combat-booted, and armored in canvas and fleece. Tasos is picking olives in his Armani jeans. And here we go with the mystery. What do you call that mountain? I asked during one of our coffee breaks on the second morning of olive picking. We have moved our equipment to the boulder-strewn grove where the Kouzis family grazes its 20 sheep. Riddled with caves and jutting ferociously into the low clouds, the crag above us is nearly barren, too steep to support any life but the most determined brambles. From that cyclopean forehead, the shoulders of the valley drop down to sea, which I can actually hear, since today angry 10-foot waves are detonating below. Inevuno, Stamatis mutters with a dismissive wave of his hand. It's a mountain. Well, but the old-timers, if they want to be specific, call it Vrakos tu Kleftoyani, Eva interjects, the hill of Yanis the thief. Who's Kleftoyani? I ask, and what did he steal? But no one responds. This morning we can see our breath, and a light drizzle has left us damp and cold. No one is in the mood for conversation. We pull coffee cups up close to our faces, peel boiled eggs and oranges, and bash open walnuts with stones, staring at the 40 or so olive trees we'll have to pick today. But as for me, Horace says in one of his odes, my simple meal consists of chicory and mallow from the garden and olives from the little olive tree. Let's let the sheep stay up there for a little while. So remember, who's Klepto Yanni? Who is Yannis the thief? And the talk. Can I begin with a quick exercise? Because this is the biggest class I've ever had. Dinner last night. Quickly jot down, either in your head or better yet on a piece of paper, what you had for dinner last night, including what you drank. Okay, make a quick list of the various products or ingredients that were used to make up that meal, as if you were cooking it from scratch. How many of you cooked it from scratch? Bravo. For instance, if you had a burger and fries and a Coke, your list would include ground meat. Was it beef, soy protein, mystery meat? A bun. Those are usually made from wheat, by the way. A piece of lettuce. That's made from lettuce. Ketchup, tomatoes. Some potatoes, some kind of oil the potatoes were fried in, and then a soda. Good luck there. Who the hell knows what's in soda? So break down that list in your mind for a second, all the ingredients. Now, check off the items that you knew where they came from. How many of these items do you know anything about the origins of them? Which country, which state, which county? Furthermore, which of these items, who grew or processed or picked or manufactured those items? This is a little cruel to do to you, by the way, in the middle of winter in Pennsylvania. Okay, got it? Here's the question I want to ask. What percentage of the meal you had last night do you know anything about? Who's at 100%? What did you have for dinner? Beautiful. And you got the eggs from? And the salad? Beautiful. Anyone else at 100%? What'd you have for dinner? Beautiful. So you're one of those chipmunks. You put stuff up so you can eat in the winter. Good. Who's closer to 50%? Okay, we got like 3 people who are 50 to 100%. How many of you are at 0%? Look around. Is this the case with most of your meals? By the way, every student probably raised her hand, right? Before I tell you 2 stories, here are a few questions I want you to consider. So we exercised some free will when we sat down to eat that meal we knew almost nothing about. And what are the repercussions of that choice? Which is to say, what are the repercussions of knowing almost nothing about the food we eat on a regular basis? Do the repercussions of our choice extend beyond us? Are they of concern to other human beings, to species, to our local economy, to our local environment? Now, I risk beginning my talk with something so cruelly rhetorical. My intention here is not to inspire guilt in you. In fact, I hope it might make you feel better, though looking around it might make you feel worse, to know that this almost complete lack of knowledge about our food system is actually the norm in this country, and it's increasingly the norm in most so-called developed nations. Which is to say, you have a lot of company. The American food system is almost entirely industrial. It depends on our ignorance and is essentially anonymous. Think about the average grocery store. Only one tiny portion of most grocery stores, the produce section, features items in their whole raw state. Of course, they have those little stickers announcing where they came from. Even if we move on to the refrigerators of meat, we see that it's been broken down in such a way that we no longer recognize it as the animal it once was. Nearly everything else in your average grocery store has been produced, processed, and packaged somewhere by someone and shipped there somehow by someone so another someone, you or me, can buy it. We don't mind it this way, of course, since the morally uncomfortable parts of the food system are kept conveniently out of view. Since we've never met them, we aren't inclined to worry too much about the migrant workers who harvest and wash and package our baby kale in California. Nor do we think about their working conditions. We don't need to think about how much petroleum is required to get Argentinian asparagus to our plate 6 months after the end of asparagus season up here in Lancaster, which is, what, June, May? We don't have to worry about what happens to animals in the enclosed spaces of a factory farm, nor what happens in a factory processing plant. The grocery store also allows us to buy into the illusion that because our food has been placed on a styrofoam plate and wrapped in plastic, it must be safe, because isn't someone somewhere making sure of that after all? And since nutritional information has been dutifully stamped right there on the side of the box or bottle, we assume that it might kind of be good for us. Here's the thing. When it comes to food, unlike almost any other aspect of our lives, we are inclined to take leap after leap of faith. And the entire industrial food system is based on the premise that more is always better, that consumers will buy anything as long as it is cheap, and that culinary ignorance is bliss. What does it mean to question any of this? What does it mean to attempt to eat with a fuller consciousness of what's on the plate we're about to devour? The poet-farmer Wendell Berry fans, raise your hands. I'm taking so many polls today. There are a few of us. Has suggested that eating is an agricultural act. I think that statement used to feel truer than it feels now, as disconnected as most of us are from the place where our food grows. My own mother, the eldest daughter in a dairy farming family in Wisconsin, estimates that her family grew or butchered just about every bit of food that wound up on their plates. Wisconsin chipmunks. Agriculture was what they called the backyard. And that was really about a generation ago. Barry's point is to remind us that in spite of technology and Walmart, our food still has to grow somewhere, maybe even in real dirt, tended to by an actual person, and taking a moment to remember that now and then can challenge us to consider the choices we make when we eat. Yes, eating is an agricultural act, and your money goes where your fork goes. For this reason, I think Michael Pollan, in his famous book, The Omnivore's Dilemma, you can ask me about cooking him dinner later, asks us to push this one step further, thinking of eating as a political act. As he puts it, let's get on the arrow here. As he puts it, how and what we eat determines to a great extent the use we make of the world and what is to become of it. What I call subversive eating is really very simple. It means attempting to eat with a fuller consciousness of our food, its origins, and the way it arrived on our plate. Now, I realize this doesn't sound so subversive, but it is. And you might ask, is it possible that something as simple as thinking might constitute a challenge to our food system? If so, that tells you a lot about the precariousness of that system, which is to say, knowing what you eat may constitute a revolutionary act. Whew. Here comes the fun part. That was the rhetorical part. I'm going to offer you two examples today of what I call conscious eating. My main aim here is not to browbeat you with any lunatic food politics. In fact, I hope you'll see one thing. Of all the revolutions you might become involved with, this one is the most delicious. One last thing before I offer my first example. I'm about to offer you case studies in what I call subversive or revolutionary eating. I should probably confess that I am a subversive character. Ask my mom, or my former high school principal for that matter. I'm also no fanatic when it comes to food. I too eat most of my meals in complete ignorance. I hereby confess there is probably a box of Fruit Loops in my cupboard at home, and I don't know what kind of tree Fruit Loops grow upon. I also eat fast food now and then because I'm overworked and fundamentally lazy, and sometimes I just surrender to convenience and stupidity and suffer the indigestion that follows. Which is to say, I don't want to ruin the experience of eating for you. In fact, I hope mainly to make you hungry, which leads me, weirdly enough, not to the kitchen, that's for later today, but to my garage. 10 years ago, I went to my local small-town Pennsylvania farmers market. This is on the other side. This is the Ohio part of Pennsylvania. And I noticed that the farmers there were actually selling produce out of boxes they'd bought at wholesalers. Where do these melons come from, and where's your farm? I asked a nice lady standing behind a ziggurat of cantaloupe. After all, the point of going to a farmer's market is to meet farmers, right? She shrugged her shoulders and said she wasn't sure. Georgia, maybe? The melons were identical to those being sold at the grocery store, but to add insult to injury, they were more expensive here. And I assume that went for all her produce, and she pretty much had every vegetable you could imagine, though many of them wouldn't come into season in Pennsylvania for several months. Over in the corner of the market space, I noticed was an Amish man who had a tiny table upon which he only had a few cucumbers and some bundles of Swiss chard. A little chalkboard said that his produce was organically grown. When I struck up a conversation with him, he said, "You know what organic means? Most people ask me what I put in my food to make it organic." Now, this is 15 years ago. He told me this was going to be his last year farming. He said regretfully that he only had 7 children, but he couldn't find a market for his produce. We talked a little about the weather and about the soil and about cucumber varieties, and he said I knew a lot about farming for an Englishman. I'm from Wisconsin. "Come out to my farm," he said, "I'll show you around." His farm was a kind of agricultural museum. Not only did he farm with a horse and plow, and without the electricity that would usually power a greenhouse, he also had an astonishing variety of produce. On only 2 small acres bisected by a beaver dam, he had planted at least 30 different crops, fertilizing them with horses and watering them with nothing but rain. Well, we walked among the rows of heirloom tomato plants and carrots and kale and blackberry bushes. I told him, more or less, "Hello, supply. My name is demand. Maybe we can work out a deal." I knew 30 families that couldn't find local organic produce grown by a farmer they knew, a field they could actually visit. We took, in about 30 seconds, a gigantic leap of faith. Nobody I'd ever contacted an hour later had ever heard of a CSA. Raise your hand if you've heard of a CSA now. Great, that's what I expect. Not Confederate States of America, community-supported agriculture. But enough people were willing to write a check that very day to invest in David's farm. So many, in fact, that in a single day, he quadrupled the amount he'd ever earned in vegetables in a single year. The vegetables would be picked and boxed up out on the farm, and we'd take turns driving out to the farm to fetch it. The boxes were delivered to my garage each Friday, and all weekend long families would walk up my driveway to pick up boxes of local produce. Basic capitalism, right? The farmer works and gets paid for the work. The consumer gets to eat celeriac and cabbage. But it's more complicated than that. The CSA is a subversive model. Without realizing it right away, it changed the way we ate, asking us to reassess certain culinary and consumer habits. When you've bought and paid for a massive box of produce grown by a charming Amish man you know, you make a point of eating it. Suddenly, what we ate was determined by what was in season. We didn't eat the horses, sorry. Eggplants weren't ready until late summer, so you didn't have eggplant parmigiano until then. Asparagus and ramps and arugula and spring garlic were enjoyed for a blissful and very stinky 3 weeks, and then they disappear until the next year. In addition to eating seasonally, which simply meant that everything tasted better, we began building our meals around the CSA, treating plants as the center of the meal instead of as a colorful garnish. Without knowing it, animal proteins, that's awkward having the horse when I say animal proteins. Vegetable centerfold is better. Animal proteins were slowly pushed to the margins of our diet instead of serving as its center. On any given plate, in any given meal, I could point to the majority of the items on that plate and say something about them. I knew where they came from, and that implied a level of consciousness and trust that seemed radical. When I told my kids, by the way, that they should eat their broccoli because David Yoder grew it for them, they wanted to. He's got a cool beard. That first year was a wild success for the Yoder family farm. In fact, 13 years later, 14, David now has 5 or 6 CSAs running, feeding about 150 families in 3 different towns. He's moved to a 15-acre farm and has even built a new house. We call this the house that arugula built. We seriously do. That knowledge alone is radical enough. By eating more vegetables, I'd improve my life and someone else's. And every dollar I gave him was a dollar I didn't spend contributing to an unsustainable and often inhumane food culture. I also knew that David treated his animals, bless you, kindly, and didn't use any pesticides or artificial fertilizer on his soil. In fact, he improved his local environment every year. The biodiversity in his farm is astounding. And I knew all of this when I ate his arugula and his beets and his sweet corn and his cherry tomatoes. A CSA is also subversive eating because it means abandoning one's sense of entitlement. You eat what the farmer and the earth gives you at the proper season, and you don't get to choose. Having run a CSA for over a decade, I'll tell you that a lot of people can't handle that. We're Americans. We don't like being told what to do, especially by nature. And yet being willing to let nature choose is a conscious choice. It asks us to look beyond our immediate hunger and gratification and see a bigger picture, one that seems much more sustainable in the long view. By running a CSA out of my garage, I'm at least connected to a farmer in his field. My children understand that eating is an agricultural act. I choose non-participation in the industrial food system as often as possible. As a result, I trust what I eat, and to be honest, I find that trust itself to be nourishing. And now we go to Greece. Have you had enough pizza? We're going to that culinary place now. I'm about to describe one of the best meals I've ever had. This meal was not eaten in a fancy restaurant with an annoyingly attentive waitstaff. This meal cost me under $20, and yet it captures the ethos of the Greek culinary tradition, which hasn't changed much in the past 2,000 years, though it's probably about to. This is on Omonia Square in Athens. McDonald's and KFC have already set up shop in Greece's largest cities, and big box stores are replacing Greece's traditional open-air markets. There is the delicious burger megarides, burger with shrimp. I know you want one. But if subversive eating means knowing about the origins of your food, then by the standards I've described, this Greek meal is entirely subversive. For the past 20 years or so, I've been spending as much time as possible on a tiny little peninsula, on a remote stretch of coastline, on a small, once famous and remote Greek island called Thasos. It is an unreasonably beautiful place. There are 3 beaches. We refer to them as Beach 1, Beach 2, and Beach 3. They're actually arranged in reverse order. If you look way up at the top of this slide, it's too dark. There's a little building with a brown roof. That's Tasso's house. You decide which beach you're going to most mornings depending on your mood or the way the wind is blowing. Beach 1 has large flat stones. This is the view from the other direction. That triangle thing there is Mount Athos off in the distance. Beach 1 has large flat stones that are good for skipping, but you have to descend a goat path to get to it. Bad idea at night. Beach 2 features archaeology. Since it's part of an ancient temple complex, you can actually dive down into the archaeology in the water. And Beach 3 features a tiny little stretch of white sand on a narrow, shallow lagoon. That's where my friend Stamatis keeps his little fishing boat, the Evanthula. It's named for his wife. She's called Evanthula too. There's the boat. Stamatis and Evakousis and their son Tassos of Thasos, who is basically a superhero, laughed at me some years ago when I mentioned the concept of local food. Since to them, it didn't really occur to them, in fact, there might be any other kind of food. A typical meal on their patio, conveniently overlooking all 3 of these beaches, bears that out. Here's the menu, for example, of a meal I ate there last summer after a long day of octopus hunting. As with all Greek meals, first come the mezes, the little plates that make up the bulk of Greek dining. You rarely ever order your own entree. You share everything in the middle of the table. I begin with a salad of still hot beets, which have been boiled until tender and dressed with a lot of olive oil, some chopped green onion, flat leaf parsley, simple red wine vinegar, and salt and pepper. Then a little plate of green beans, which have been cooked in a wood oven with onion, tomatoes, garlic, and a lot of olive oil. This is my refrain. Then a plate of octopus, which arrives at the table still hissing from the grill, dusted with some oregano and topped with more olive oil and some green onions. I scarf this down quickly while sipping an anise-laced and very potent moonshine called Sipuro. Think of this as Ouzo's evil cousin. One man told me it will put hair on your feet. In addition to making you very, very happy, and I mean, you're already in Greece, which means you're already happy. This makes you even more happy. The stuff works as an aperitif should. It makes you happily famished. There's Tassos of Thasos and Stamatis at the still having Sipuro for breakfast. It's actually dripping out the end. That's why they're so happy. That's good, being hungry, being famished, because once the mezeles are pushed aside, Tasos of Thasos brings me some barbunya. I dedicate an entire chapter of my Honey Olives Octopus book to this fish. We call it, unfortunately, red mullet in English. It turns bright red when you dust it with flour and toss it in hot oil. The flesh of barbunya is sweet, and I always say it reminds me of lobster. I eat everything, including the heads, because Tassos tells me to. Just a few bones left on my plate. Maybe I should also add, for poetic effect, that I eat all of this under the gentle shade of a trellis of grapevines, and I get to look at those beaches. Where did all this food come from? Well, the beets, green onions, parsley, tomatoes, and green beans came from Evanthula's garden out back. I wake most mornings to the sound of her singing to herself while she pulls weeds to throw in the compost pile. Tasos of Thasos caught the octopus with his bare hands down on beach 1. Since we dive for octopus together whenever I'm there, I know, close your ears, vegetarians, he probably bit it between the eyes to put it out of its misery, then whacked it against a rock 40 times. To tenderize it, I can actually see the octopus whacking rock from where I eat. And then he hung it in the sun for a day or two to tenderize. Stamatis caught the barbunya with some nets cast over the edge of the Evanthula just that morning. He puts his nets out where the currents come in out of beach 3, leaves them for a few hours, and then returns to pull them up. Some nights he catches nothing. Some nights he'll haul in a wheelbarrow of squid and red mullet and sea bream and mackerel. He's been fishing these waters for 30 years and knows every inch of coastline. When I sit with him and sip coffee in the morning, or siporo, he explains to me by looking at some weird ripples out on the horizon whether or not it's worth going fishing that day and whether it will rain over the weekend. He never catches more than he needs, and he's respected around the island for his knowledge of local history and the local environment. He also looks like a Greek fisherman should, half pirate, half Popeye. As for those grapes overhead, well, those were fermented in barrels behind the laundry room and were then distilled into that moonshine in a 250-year-old Revolutionary War era still completely illegal out in the olive grove. It pleases me to think that where our people were fighting the Revolutionary War, Tasos of Thasos and his relatives were up making liquor. Finally, the olive oil. Olive oil is its own food group in Greece, and Greeks eat a lot of it. Luckily, it's one of the healthiest things you can eat, provided it is extra virgin and preferably organic. The Kouzis family owns about 1,000 olive trees out in the hills below. Do you remember Kleftoyani, the hill of Yanis the thief? There they harvest them by hand and press them in a nearby olive press. All the old people, and there are a lot of old people in Greece, begin every day this way: spoon, olive oil, down the hatch. It's the secret of youth. I leave with a 5-liter bottle of the stuff every time I come home. There we are, raking the olive trees. Those are the thrumbes I write about in the first chapter. I probably should stop before I get carried away. Let me admit this. The Kouzis family has the immense luxury of living in a culinary paradise. They eat every meal with a full consciousness of what is on their plate. And let me be clear, it is a hell of a lot of work to eat this way. From the morning you wake up until the evening, you are either fishing or working or harvesting or pulling weeds. And I know this all probably sounds stupidly poetic, a little over the top even. Beyond that, it's just ordinary, healthy gluttony. But here's the subversive thing about this meal. All of it grew or was caught within 1 mile of where I ate it, and the food was handled and cooked by people who grew or caught it, and they cooked it in their own very clean kitchen the way Grandma taught them to. And they know, above all, the history of the soil that feeds them. To illustrate this last point, I was going to return to the memoir if I have time. How am I doing? Okay. She hasn't raised the banana yet. Good. Remember the mystery of Kleftoyani Vrakos? Let's find out what it is. A few nights later, at the bar, we get a few titillating details about the hill of the elusive Kleftoyani. We have just eaten a feast of ortikia, tiny local quail that Tassos' cousin, also named Tassos, there's 2 superheroes named Tasos of Thasos on the island, has grilled with astonishing dexterity over the roaring flames of a fireplace in the corner. Every morsel of the quail is as rich and fatty as duck liver, with an added grassiness that must be the result of the birds nesting in the marshes on the mainland. Even the men at our table know they are being treated to a delicacy, and they nod with reverential gratitude toward the man who shot these birds, a resident of Kavala, famous even here on an island across the water for his ability to bring down these tiny wildfowl with his gun. Tassos' uncle, Triandaphilos, cuts an imposing figure. His enormous shoulders look even broader because he cradles one arm in a sling at the middle of his chest. A black raincoat has been slung across his shoulders like a cape. His features might betray a hint of foreign ancestry. His loose jaw, flat nose, and cheerful blue eyes are anomalous among the table of Thasian men gathered here, who all look related to one another and who, it turns out, are. After dislocating his shoulder in a fall some years ago, Triandaphilos refused proper treatment, and now his right hand is all but seized up. The fingers that protrude from the end of his sling are as swollen as bratwurst. He also moves with the careful deliberation of one in pain. In spite of his injury, it's clear he's still ferociously strong. He's just muttered, "Kalinikta," good night, his good hand raised in farewell, when Tassos implores him to tell us what he knows about the hill of Yanis the thief. "Who wants to know?" he asks. "The writer, Mr. Professor Christopher." "Well, during the years when the Turks were here," he explains, while refusing a chair with a little nod of the chin, "the people lived off nothing. They had olives and wild greens, maybe a mountain hare now and then for the stew pot, if they managed to keep a gun." "No, that story takes place during the years of the Bulgarians," someone interrupts. Po, what's the difference? "The people were hungry both times," Triandaphilos says, with the dramatic backward shrug the Greeks employ to indicate absurdity or exasperation. This man Yanis lived alone. Who knows why? And would keep himself alive by pinching a tomato or a watermelon here and there from the gardens of the shepherds' wives. Or he'd make off with a handful of their eggs. Never too much. Everyone understood that the man needed to eat, so out of charity, no one reported him. These were human crimes. Anyway, they couldn't have caught him if they wanted to, since he followed the paths up into the mountain only the goats knew. And he kept his loot in a cave that no one has ever found. The mountain was named for him. In few landscapes is history as legible as in Greece, where all the place names bear the weight of classical association. Sparta, Corinth, Thebes. It's difficult to think of them in realistic terms as the rather destitute and depressing little towns they now are. So I find it refreshing and somewhat touching to learn that a far more recent history, or mythology, has been inscribed here on an obscure bluff in an obscure corner of a once famous little island. When Triandaphilos leaves, I ask Tassos if all the hills have names, if all the old people have such history in their veins. No. People like my uncle are hard to find now. The details are being forgotten, Tassos says. The famous bird killer of Kavala, depositing one last bit of quail carcass in the ashtray before him, concurs, then raises his glass while proclaiming a village proverb everyone else around the table seems to know. If you don't have an old man in your family, you should buy one. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Brett Klasky. I'm actually in Professor Trellis's class, and we're reading your book, Honey, Olives, and Octopus. In the first chapter, you discuss the method by which they harvest the olives.
Yeah.
And you discuss the machine that was made by the Italian men that beat the olive tree and compare it to the rake that they use. And my question is, do they not use the machines and choose to do it by hand consciously, or is it just a passive thing that they culturally are staying the same way just because that's the way they do it, or are they actively trying to preserve their culture?
Good. Ask a farmer this question, they say, why would I actively try to keep my culture going when it's more work than it has to be? And that's a simple-minded way of answering. On the one hand, actually raking, so you use these tiny little rakes, they're on like a broom handle, and it takes a long time to rake an olive tree. I found it beautifully pleasurable, but I only did it for one harvest season. Imagine if you had to do this all the years of your life. So the easiest way to answer your question is, when someone comes around selling a pneumatic olive whacker on a long telescoping rod, you say, rather than climbing up a ladder and maybe falling out and braining myself in the stones, I could use that. Most farmers will say yes. That said, the number of hours we spend complaining about the stupid machinery because it constantly breaks down, you have to drag a generator out into the olive grove, makes a huge amount of racket. So there is also this sense that, well, this does make our job easier, but it's such a drag. All right. To answer your question one other way, you may know that Greece right now is undergoing what can only be described as an economic catastrophe, though the new elections are stirring things up in interesting ways. 25% of Greeks right now 75% of Greeks under the age of 75 are currently unemployed. So you've gone to Franklin and Marshall, it's the equivalent in Greece, you've gotten an expensive education, and do you know what happens next? Nothing. There are no jobs. Guess what occupation is becoming the most popular occupation for overeducated young Greeks under the age of 25? Not assassination, no. Farming, in fact. A lot of young Greeks are saying there are no real economic jobs, and though all my life I've looked at Yaya, grandma, who would climb up in that damn tree, she's 80 years old, and whack olives when she could have used expensive material. I've always wondered, why the traditional ways, Yaya? And they're finding some value again in looking back, I think, at the value of the rake and what you make with your hands. Right. And so there's a return to that, I think, happening. That's a long-winded answer.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ. I have a question about what you're seeing, the impact of membership in the EU is having on Greek agriculture. Yeah. And I ask specifically, last fall I was in Andros and a Greek friend was lamenting that the tomatoes weren't good for the first time ever.
Yeah.
Because the farmers didn't save seeds and plant as they had traditionally, but because they were assigned tomato production as part of the EU scheme, used seeds that had come from elsewhere.
Yeah. Did you all hear the question? Tomatoes. Now, first of all, Greek tomatoes should be a holy substance. When you eat a Greek tomato, it is pardon the phrase, the Platonic idea of a tomato. I think Plato talks about these in the Republic, doesn't he, Kostis? Yes. So eating a bad tomato in Greece makes no sense whatsoever. Part of this comes down, I'll give you the sad part of the story and then maybe a better part. Part of this does come down to EU subsidies. I don't know too much about this, but I do know that there are agreements. You will ship us the following products, we'll take your olive oil, but you must agree then, Greece, to purchase certain products. So I actually was in a Greek restaurant on a Greek island, and I mean, there were gardens behind the building, and they were eating those tomatoes. And the tomatoes they were serving in this little restaurant, I went out back, and the crates were there, produce of Denmark. This is in the summer in Greece. No wonder the tomatoes were bad. You don't eat, why would you eat Danish tomatoes in Greece? So you do see some of that. To be honest, you see it much more in heavily touristed areas, where a lot of Greek restaurants now are like American restaurants. Some guy pulls up in a truck, Cisco, or the equivalent of, unloads a lot of frozen products made elsewhere, and then they're served as Greek food. In a real traditional Greek restaurant, and the ones that I celebrate in my book, there's a garden out back, and that's where the food comes from. But let me go back to the seeds. So that's the sad story. I think EU membership has led to some, what I would call culinary blasphemy. So I have this other friend who runs a company called Ta Milelia, one of the first real great organic food companies in Greece. They sell in all the airports. It started out in Lesbos, the island of Lesbos, Mytilene. And he pulled me aside last time. He said, I was approached by the mayor of the city of Drama. This is up in Thrace. And he said, he has collected a bank of grain seeds, heirloom grain seeds that have been preserved by families for generations. And he wants to do a kind of exposition field, take 20 acres and plant these different heirloom grain seeds and then distribute the seeds. He said, do you want to come up with me? You write the brochure and I'll do the farming. I mean, the idea of quitting my job right there was extremely appealing. To become an anthropologist of heirloom grains? Yeah, sign me up. But of course I didn't do it. I had to go back and resume my life as department chair in the Department of Anguish at Allegheny College. But I've got a friend who lives near Drama, and she said, I'm doing this thing this summer. It's so fascinating. There is this group that gathers heirloom seeds. It's completely frowned upon by the agricultural powers that be because they want you to buy their seeds. Most of them aren't sold by Monsanto in Europe. That would be the equivalent here. But she said, we go and you see all the old ladies bringing the heirloom seeds that they've saved from the previous year, and it's more or less a free barter. Talk to me about those cucumbers and that variety of cucumbers. So that's happening. It's really exciting. And not only do you see old ladies there, you also are starting to see, again, this generation of 20-somethings who are trying to see out from under the culinary blasphemies I talked about. Yeah.
Hi there. Thank you so much for this talk. It was really fascinating getting to hear about sort of the qualitative experience that you've had in eating from and knowing exactly where the food you are eating is coming from. My question is, it feels, without sounding too cynical, like not knowing where your food is coming from or having this type of experience might be characterized as a little bit of a first world problem. And when you look not just across the globe, but within the United States at places that are food deserts where there isn't the opportunity to have a CSA, to know the Amish person who's making this crop and being able to bring it to you. Is there a way, do you think, to expand this to other places, and for the places that don't have those types of opportunities that are readily available, what would you say sort of to the quality of their ability to eat and sustain themselves?
I think you're asking me about class.
Maybe, yeah.
To some degree, which is, isn't it a little bit bourgeois in other words, to be in a CSA? Doesn't that require a certain amount of, say, economic privilege? Yes, to write a check for $450 to eat vegetables, that may not be in everyone's sort of possibility. But here's the thing I would say. I'll approach this a couple of ways. First of all, when I talked to my Amish farmer about organic farming, he said, even the Amish were bought out by the pesticide companies. Even the Amish, and all the Amish looked at him and said, you're doing a really weird thing. Why would you give up all of these, what it turns out are kind of modern farming comforts, to go back? And he said, well, this is the way my grandparents farmed. So there's nothing radical about it. So on the one hand, you're returning back to something that's very simple. But a CSA is not going to be possible, as you point out, for everybody. And when you said other places, you didn't mean outside the country, you meant other places even in the US maybe.
Yeah, sure.
I think the most interesting thing that's happened in my own community is we've got a huge community garden that started. In fact, it's run right out of our food kitchen. And in exchange for maybe 4 or 5 hours of work in the garden, which, by the way, people find really stimulating, people who cannot afford a CSA get a cut from the garden. So there are many, many other economic models other than what I agree with you is a kind of, I would call it bourgeois, I'm a Marxist, so there you go. There are a lot of other models for spreading this around. Farming is pretty simple. It's dirt and seeds and labor. And that is something that can easily be, I think, swept away from the trappings of class. So the community gardens, you also see a huge number of urban gardens starting up. I think this is a bigger problem for people who live in cities. You guys are surrounded by farmland here, right? the idea of going to a farmer's market is pretty easy for us. What do you do if you live in Brooklyn? And so the other thing you're seeing is really interesting community gardens on a 1 acre of land in the middle of a city. This is the other model that I think could work. I don't know if it really answered your question exactly, but the CSA certainly is not the only model. Returning maybe to a simpler eating as an agricultural act, that is so fundamental, I think, and that really is the key to what I guess I would use to answer your question. Make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Uh-oh.
I know.
Hi.
Hi, I'm Ayla. Whoa. I'm Ayla. I'm an environmental science animal behavior major. And kind of piggybacking off of that question, actually. So do you think that for CSAs and kind of going back to this know where your food comes from mantra, do you think we're going to have to kind of decrease technology with how we grow our food, basically, and kind of go back to labor and maybe not necessarily like horse and plow kind of deal like the Amish, but kind of...
We do like our light switch, yeah.
Yeah. So do you think it's going to have to, people are going to have to see agriculture as more of a hands-on thing that you can do for yourself as opposed to going off and buying things at the grocery store?
Yeah, I think absolutely. It doesn't mean we have to return to subsistence farming, of course, because who wants to do that? It is a lot of work. I'll tell you one story that I think of as kind of what I use as the horror story that guides me in certain ways. So my grandfather, Eugene Meyer, in Monroe, Wisconsin, Swiss immigrant. I come from cheese-making people. By the way, I'm not Greek. I'm Swiss and Norwegian from Wisconsin. It doesn't make any sense, all of this. He was a dairy farmer, sold all of his milk. He started on organic dairy farmer, sold all of his milk locally to cheese factories. They had about 3 acres they put aside for vegetables too, and they would sell some on the roadside stand. They had a good life and a good living. They worked their butts off, for sure. And when my grandfather decided to expand his farm a little bit, another farm came up for sale, he said, well, how am I going to farm this much? And it was about that moment that one of the big chemical companies came in and said, we have this thing called DDT, and it will allow you to simplify your farming a lot. Also, along with DDT, you really need a big tractor. And so my grandfather took out his first big loan for what was kind of a mini mega tractor at that point. It's no coincidence that there are huge cancer rates in my mother's family. They used DDT for several years. Quickly saw that that was not working very well because they were all getting sick. Got rid of the DDT, but by the time my grandfather retired with emphysema, my uncle took over the farm. And the first thing he did is he plowed all of the crops down. They had probably 20 or 30 different crops. And it was this kind of a self-sustaining cycle. Stuff to feed the pigs, stuff to feed the cows. You raise your own alfalfa. And he bought 3 gigantic tractors, sold his life to the bank, $1 million in debt, and planted only corn. He is no longer a farmer. In fact, the entire farm went down with that ship. Corn prices dropped. So this is a terrible story, but in certain ways, here was the mistake. It was buying out to chemical companies, implement companies. Does that mean you cannot practice farming at a large level? I don't think so, but there's certainly a lesson to be learned there. That was a sad story. To tell to a person in crutches, I've made you sit down, yeah. But maybe 1 tractor, maybe 20 crops, maybe 10 crops. It's when you switch to monoculture and you pesticide everything that farming gets unsustainable, I think. So indeed, finding more sustainable models, that's your job. I'm just a writer. You're the environmental studies, science? Yes. How do you find more sustainable models? Well, part of that is, I think, simplifying and also divorcing from some of the bad habits American farmers have bought into. Yeah. Sure.
Hi, I'm Annalisa Cornell. I'm a mathematician here.
I don't know anything about math, but I'll do my best.
Thanks. So I actually first learned about food in college reading Francis Moore LePay. We could all go to the beach. That's okay.
What's going on back here? That's not Greece.
So I first learned about food by reading Francis Moore LePay, and then I got to hear Linda Aleche, who's here on campus, talk, and then I read Barbara Kingsolver. So I was a little struck in your presentation by seeing mostly men talking about food, and I just wanted to know if you had thought sort of beyond the maybe gender roles or even beyond Caucasians and Europeans about how this affects the world larger. So,
Yeah,
thanks.
yeah. I know Frances. She's a delight. So is her daughter. Her daughter's a force of nature. Have you ever met her daughter? Frances and Anna. They came to Allegheny College. They're both about to give their talk on exactly the matter you're speaking about. And the president of the college ran into the gymnasium, not quite this big, and said, we all have to go to the basement of the library. A tornado is coming. This was the force of Frances Moore LePay. I think you ask a great question. Ironically enough, I mean, of course, with the Amish, yes, it is a patriarchal society. So we'll put that aside for a second. In Greece, to be honest, agriculture is definitely something that women control, maybe too strong of a word, but the culinary production of Greece is really handled by women, almost exclusively. Eva is there, and if you want to know who's in charge of the olive harvest, it's Eva, not Stamatis. He's a fisherman. In fact, she reminds me of that all the time. So I think you ask a great question. If I didn't feature it in my presentation, read the book, and you'll see that almost everyone I consulted, when I did the research for my book, I said, how do I find out about traditional Greek foodways? Because I've been told they're disappearing. Every person I needed to meet was a woman. So that's really important. Do you know the writer Vandana Shiva? She does really interesting work actually with heirloom seeds. And she said the future of agriculture in the world is women saving heirloom seeds and passing them along to their daughters. So I think this is a huge key. So I'm sorry if my presentation made it seem like I only researched men. In fact, they were just kind of the picturesque backdrop of women who control everything. Yeah.
I actually have a question. I'm not
okay,
asking
where's
you
the banana?
Stop.
You ate the banana.
I'm not being timekeeper. I'm not being timekeeper. You talk a lot about, vegetables and agriculture, but one of the things that I think is subversive about Greek food, as well as Sicilian food, I'm married to a Sicilian American.
Congratulations.
And I don't have any Italian in me either. Is eating things like octopus, or I'll give you an example. I grew up in Brooklyn. I was used to going to Italian restaurants and eating babalucha, snails, all right? Go out to UC San Diego for graduate school, and people are poisoning the snails in their garden, and I didn't understand why they weren't gathering them and cooking them.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about eating sort of things that most Americans don't want to eat?
This is Bizarre Foods with Christopher Bakken. Yeah. And I eat anything. Are you asking me, what kinds of weird things have you eaten? Is that? Yeah. Sure. Well, I mean, you have to have access, first of all. I mean, that's part of it. But the simplest way to answer your question is this. When you ate meat for years, you didn't eat tenderloin. In fact, you began with the cheapest things, the innards, the sweetbreads, the kidneys, the liver. My kids beg me to make them chicken liver pate. They take it in thermoses and they have little tea parties out at recess, and they eat chicken liver pate. I mean, I've completely brainwashed them, evidently. But learning, I think, to eat with the very cheapest cuts, the shoulder parts, that's how you learn to cook, because you can't survive on the stuff that the rich guy in the manor eats. So part of it also is eating down on the animal, as they say, or nose to snout. I think that's part of it. As terms of weird things that I've eaten, well, octopus, for sure, is not even weird. I want that every single day. There is something at the bottom of the sea that looks like a stone. In fact, it is a stone. And I don't know how on earth Thasos finds it. It's called fouskes. Kostis, have you had fouskes? So he'll dive down about till you can't see him anymore, very deep under the water. All you see is some bubbles rising from the murk. And he comes up with a handful of rocks, and he says, we're going to eat these for dinner. And these are these strange little mollusks that are very bright, kind of orange in color, and they basically taste like nasty, bitter, fermented clams. Did I mention I don't like them? But they're extremely good for your thyroid gland. So fouskes are one of those very strange things that I've never seen them outside of Thasos. They seem only in one of the beaches on Thasos, and only these guys know how to gather them. In fact, that bird killer of Kavala I mentioned, do you know how we got to eat quail that day? I don't even mention this in the book. He has a thyroid condition, and he called Tasos and he said, dude, you hook me up with a bag of fusques, I'll bring you some quail from Kavala. And that's actually that was the occasion for that meal. Yeah. So one more? Yeah. You can ask me later about strange things. Yeah.
I'm Julia Fleisch. I study sociology and Spanish here. And I wanted to ask a little bit about how we as students can have more of this connection to our food system when like more than half of us are required to be on a meal plan, or half of us are required to be on a meal plan, and our school has a contract with Sodexo that's a multi...
Did you say the word Sodexo?
Yeah.
I thought I heard Sodexo. Yeah, okay.
And Sodexo has been like relatively responsive within their means to respond to our requests to get local food where they can, but still we're very much entrenched in this corporate food system, and there are a lot of limitations. And so how can we as students still strive to have a connection with our food system in this corporate kind of system?
Let's say academic culture.
Academic culture,
yeah.
And also, can this food connectivity exist within the current model of institutional dining?
I love this question. So you feel a little trapped?
A little bit.
Here I am. I'm tied to this sort of food plan and whatnot. There are a lot of things that can be done, and I've tried to do this at Allegheny. In fact, we got a bunch of students who really wanted to push for this. Do you know what the roadblock is? It's called insurance. So we went to Sodexo, the guy who ran, we also have Sodexo at Allegheny, and I really applaud them. Often they try to be really flexible, but then we'd hit a wall. My farmer is willing to sell, 800 cabbages to you for build a lunch around cabbage. The first question is, so we need to be in contact with this farmer's insurance agent to make sure he's got the proper liability insurance, because what if someone gets sick from this cabbage? Who do we sue? That's a real question, and it's a real roadblock, and that's good luck changing that. You probably won't. At the same time, finding opportunities to integrate local food into the food service is a great thing to do. One of the things that people did at Allegheny is they actually started a student-led CSA, but of course none of them are farmers, they're too busy studying for sociology exams. But they approached a local farmer and they said, we want to somehow find a way to get connected with local food. If we volunteer on your farm, can we take a cut of the produce? And it was kind of a I work for Beets, we'll work for Beets program. That works as well, but how do you get that integrated? You have to push for change as well, and you have to be willing to work and help people at Sodexo see over those roadblocks. But it involves trust, and we're not very good at that in this country. Yeah.